Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. And thank you, Linda, for that amazing, warm, generous introduction. I really appreciate the invitation to talk to you today about Tennyson. And this is very new work, like written specially for this talk, but part of a book in progress where I'm considering popular Victorian poetry, in particular poetry published in ephemeral print, such as periodicals, newspapers, and magazines. I am just going to try and advance my slide just a moment. There we go. So this talk addresses the widespread practice from the 1860s of excerpting and illustrating Tennyson's poetry in Victorian periodicals, magazines, and newspapers. My interest in this overlooked feature of serial print culture and of Tennyson's poetry corpus all began with this page, which you can see on the right of the slide, that many years ago, when I encountered it as part of my ongoing work with Digital Victorian Periodical Poetry, or DVPP for short, when my team of research assistants were indexing the late Victorian magazine Atalanta and wondered if this counted as a poem. And this question, what counts as a poem, in the messy and diverse world of periodical print, came to be one of our recurring questions, surprising to me anyway at the time. And it turned out that extracts from Tennyson were at the center of that question. And so when I was asked to give a talk to you on Tennyson, I couldn't resist spending more time with this widespread scissors and paste practice, whereby snippets from poetry were illustrated and repurposed for the pages of ephemeral print. And I'll also address what this might mean for Tennyson's reception, as well as for the Victorian treatment of the famous melancholic effect of his poetic line, as recently discussed by Peter MacDonald, in terms of its endlessly repeating dying fall. Because of an ongoing interest in the relationship between print format, especially illustration and page layout, and poetic form. MacDonald gives the well-known anecdote from William Allingham's Gossipy Diary, whereby Tennyson corrected Allingham's recitation of one line from Morte d'Arthur, and as Allingham relays it, Tennyson insisted on, quote, a peculiar, incomplete cadence at the end, unquote. And in his sharp analysis of this nebulous quality of the Tennysonian falling cadence, MacDonald remarks that, quote, the sounds of their repeated dying are also the sounds of a poetry that is always, forever and ever, coming to life, unquote. But I wonder what this would mean for the popular poetry culture of extracting and illustrating Tennyson's poetry, where a small handful of Tennyson's lines, often as few as 2 lines, are set out on their own and embedded below or even within a prominent illustration, and sometimes as an obvious fragment, and sometimes with broken lines as well. I expected when I started to think about this that the dying fall of the Tennyson poetic line would be disrupted and somehow made visually and sonically dissonant by this cut and paste treatment. But I've come to think that while fragmenting Tennyson's poetry might disrupt the formal and visual integrity of the line, it doesn't necessarily diminish or distort its poetic effect. And in fact, in terms of some of the examples I'm going to show you, I think the contrary, I think it might enhance the poetic effect of the falling cadence. So I'll begin with this example from In Memoriam to suggest why the apparently trivial appearance of Tennysonian fragments might be worthy of attention. And then I'll widen my scope to explain some more about the Victorian era's poetry extraction culture and why Tennyson has a central place in it. And I'll then give some more examples from 2 other periodical titles, so the English Illustrated Magazine and the Graphic, the illustrated newspaper. And then I'll conclude with some ideas about how we might approach the relationship between Tennyson's illustrated poetry extracts and the poetic line as a formal effect, especially as the poetic line is so crucial to poetry's widespread inclusion in periodical print, as we'll see. And also, by way of introduction, I want to acknowledge the diversity of Tennyson's appearances in periodical print. Tennyson's personal interaction with periodical publishing were often fraught and complex business, as Kitty Ledbetter's work magnificently reveals. But his poetry went viral, if you forgive me for using a modern term, through its extensive circulation and recirculation in periodical publications in a range of ways that aren't always fully acknowledged, including feature poems that Tennyson himself placed in a wide variety of titles throughout his career. And this lovely example here, although it's not a terribly good poem, is from Good Words in March 1868, with a prominent illustration by Frederick Leighton. And although, of course, not all feature poems were illustrated. And just another example of Tennysonian appearances in periodical print are the generous inclusions of his poems in review essays. And this example shows Mariana, quoted in full within John Wilson's review of Tennyson in Blackwell's Edinburgh Magazine for May 1832. And this review essay quotes in full 20 poems. And of course, there are other kinds of prose contributions that quote in full Tennyson poems, including periodical fiction. And also, the periodical practice of illustrating poetry excerpts from Tennyson, often in splashy full pages. So this example is from the English Illustrated magazine, October 1897, with an illustration by Gilbert James. And it's this last appearance of Tennyson in periodicals, typically overlooked as trivial, which I want to focus on today. But I can't help also telling you that this week, my research assistants also found another really fun way of repurposing Tennyson in periodicals when they found a comedic sample advert for Buncombe's liver pills and McGill's Turkish carpets, which interlineated the first stanza of The Palace of Art with an advert for these consumer goods, which is really hilarious. And if you're interested, that's from the Graphic, the 3rd of October, 1896. Okay, so as I've mentioned, I've been tracking Tennyson's diverse and prolific appearances in serial print as part of my ongoing project, Digital Victorian Periodical Poetry, funded through two Shirk Insight grants, that's the Canada Federal Funding Agency, based on British long Victorian periodical print at the University of Victoria's Special Collections. And currently, DVPP includes poems from 29 periodicals, and it contains 3 interoperable projects all in one. So firstly, a poetry index of over 20,800 poems with metadata and page images for each periodical run up to the end of 1901. And we've also conducted extensive attribution research as well. And we consider verse translations into English, as well as complete poems in prose contributions as part of the index too. And secondly, we offer a transcribed and encoded poetry sample of over 2,700 poems, marked up in TEI XML for Poetic and material features like rhyme, genre, and illustration attributes. So this sample is ongoing, but I think all of Tennyson's poetry in the corpus is currently encoded. And finally, we have a personography of 5,200 people, including poets, translators, and illustrators, with metadata and mini biographical notes as well. So my material for this talk is taken from the unpublished development site, sorry, although you'll only have access to the published version if you search for the project. And currently, in our development site, the DVPP corpus includes 97 poems by Tennyson, and 26 of those poems are illustrated. And then at least 20 of these illustrated poems are full-page illustrated excerpts. And we're still counting them. So this is obviously just a tiny fraction of Victorian periodical print, but it suggests that Tennyson's poetry was circulated from the 1860s especially through prominently positioned excerpts. Okay, and so I'm winding back to the illustrated stanza from In Memoriam, a timely example for us today. So extracting and illustrating In Memoriam in Atalanta. 136 years ago, in December 1889, Victorian middle and upper class young women opened up the latest monthly issue of the proto-feminist illustrated magazine, Atalanta, to read the latest seasonal offerings in poetry and prose, including the 4 lines from In Memoriam that you've seen, and I'll show you again in a moment. Atalanta was a new girl magazine running from 1887 to 1889, offering entertainment, acculturation, and education to women who were looking to expand the private sphere of conventional motherhood and embrace new opportunities, but nothing too shocking. The magazine regularly featured essays on university colleges for women, travel, history, and suitable employments. It also offered sample examination and essay questions about literature and history, and actively solicited reader contributions too. Atalanta also very regularly included poetry, especially poetry that was illustrated in complex and innovative ways. And so it illustrated 300 out of its 512 poems in its run. And the title Atalanta, interestingly, captures the target audience, women between girlhood and adulthood. Atalanta, of course, was a Greek mythic hunter and heroine whose main attributes were beauty and athleticism and a keen determination to remain unmarried. And she agreed with her father to marry any man who could outrun her, based on her confidence at her running speed. And Atalanta was, of course, finally tricked in a race with a suitor, Hippomenes, who threw her 3 golden apples as a cunning distraction, and she was caught by him in the action of stooping down to pick them up. The magazine's title page features an illustration of Atalanta, which you can see on the slide here, at the moment before the capture, as she bends towards the final golden apple, implying that the magazine also similarly is aimed at girls caught between their girlhood and their marriage, but nothing here to alarm Papa. In the December 1889 issue, the reader would encounter an illustrated excerpt appropriate for the Christmas season. The image depicts a church tower set in the distance, surrounded by dense foliage and grey skies. The poem underneath, 4 lines long, serves as both a caption to the illustration, and at the same time, the illustration serves as a visual depiction of the poem. And as the citation makes very clear, the poem is from the well-known Christmas section of In Memoriam. The time draws near the birth of Christ, the moon is hid, the night is still, a single church below the hill is pealing, folded in the mist. Extracting this stanza and attaching it to the bottom of a full-page illustration repurposes and miniaturizes the poem. Excerpted and condensed, this stanza, with its explanatory source citation, serves to represent the considerably longer poem from which it's taken. In Memoriam, clearly in its entirety not a good candidate for a periodical poem, has been cut and pasted into a 4-line illustrated magazine excerpt, gesturing to the larger whole from which it's taken, as well as forming by itself a tiny descriptive lyric. It's tempting to speculate what the new girl reader of Atalanta would have made of this magazine page. We know from the foundational work of Linda Hughes that periodical poetry was a crucial aspect of both Victorian poetry and also periodical print, despite its long reputation as trite or sentimental filler. Victorian magazines attracted varying models of reading, including browsing, focused reading, perhaps based on the contents page, and serendipitous reading as well. And recently, some critics have argued that poetry contributions to Victorian periodicals, magazines, and newspapers represented a markedly different kind of space from the surrounding miscellaneous prose contributions, especially because of the different visual effects of poetry in a page layout that inevitably gave it more space around the letterpress. And I'm thinking particularly of the impact of the poetic line here in periodical print, as you'll see in a moment. So Kaylee Anus, for example, a former PhD student of mine, Kaylee suggests that poems in the Victorian religious magazine Good Words invited a meditative, reflective, and often spiritual pause, offering the poem as a space, calling the readers into a different and heightened kind of attentiveness than the swathes of surrounding prose. And Lorraine Coistra, also focusing on Good Words, proposes that illustrated magazine poems empower the reader with what she terms a visual poetics of everyday life, adding, quote, "Perhaps at no time before or since have poetry and pictures been such an integral part of daily life for a mass readership," unquote. Atalanta magazine's December 1889 illustrated In Memoriam excerpt is situated within a rich serial print culture that very regularly featured poetry in an uncountable quantity. Andrew Hobbs, however, does venture that the Victorian provincial press alone published over 5 million poems, making the publishers of magazines, periodicals, and newspapers the era's main poetry publishers. The particular treatment of Tennyson's poem in Atalanta, and by the way, this is the only one of his poems that the magazine published, calls attention to directly, I think, to its material and graphic space, as readers need to rotate the page to view the poem and the illustration, a format for illustrated poems that does happen sometimes, though it's not terribly typical in my experience. And the size and placement of the extract in relation to the illustration simultaneously indicates apparent contradictions. So firstly, the stanza is both an extract that points to the larger poem from which it's taken, and also a condensed poem in its own right. And secondly, the stanza is illustrated by the image placed above it, and also the stanza forms a caption to that image. And because of the illustrated poetry excerpts publication in this New Girl magazine, these 4 illustrated lines from In Memoriam also suggest that either the reader recognizes the stanza already, or prompted by the helpful mention of the longer poem, they should recognize it, and that the stanza is something memorable and recitable, something to be shared in the Christmas season. I'm going to put the poem the right way up now. There we are. In addition, because the illustrated poetry extract is published in this seasonal issue and positioned between 2 prose contributions about the festive season, the effect is to heighten the sense of seasonal time and the ephemeral and yet recurring moment of reading, just as the extract also addresses the approaching Advent season. So the time draws near, it begins. The moment also of the poem, so the still night in the excerpt, and also the sense of time being recorded as it passes, so the pealing church bells. The ABBA envelope stanza form, which many critics have explored as a brilliant rhyme effect throughout In Memoriam, of indicating, of course, a stasis with the internal B couplet and progression with the A end rhymes, beginning and the end of the quatrains. There's a kind of series of mini lyrics within each section, and also a kind of Petrarchan sonnet fragment. So this envelope stanza form kind of also heightens this extract's engagement, I think, with different kinds of temporality, history, and emotions too. And here I'm thinking of Naomi Levine's book on rhyme. It's a magnificent book, which I'm currently in the process of reading. So something also happens to the poetic line, I think, in this extract, because taken away from its place in the section and from the elegy overall, the quatrain seems to lose the overt propulsion onwards of In Memoriam's host of separate but connected stanzas and sections. However, to the magazine reader, I think that this extracted stanza retains the memory of what's missing as it gestures to the whole form from which it's taken too. And this is something that Mark Turner calls the lossiness, so his term, the lossiness of print culture, which invites us to attend to what Turner calls, quote, that repeated movement of expansion and contraction, of profusion and containment, unquote, rather than to what has been omitted and also lost. For Mark Turner, this loss, or what's left out of periodical print, needn't always be melancholic, he says. That rather, he argues, it's the defining feature of serial print. And yet I wonder, what happens when both the poetry extract and its missing remainder is imbricated in this poetics of melancholy, and when the illustrated extract emphasizes lines that are famous for their falling cadence. And so it seems to me that the falling cadence of the Tennysonian poetic line is surely enhanced in the process of extraction and illustration, as the lines point to what's missing, while the illustration deepens the poetic mood. And I can't help thinking too that by this particular reading month, this moment, December 1889, we might think that Shorley was at a height of his global celebrity, to some degree even representing the era's poetry. In fact, the term Victorian poetry itself was coined by the Columbia University professor Edmund Clarence Stedman in his 1875 anthology Victorian Poets, with close reference to Tennyson and his school. And of course, although no one would know it yet, it was almost 3 years before Tennyson's death on the 6th of October 1892. And so Tennyson was by this time clearly established, despite his protestations, as Kitty Ledbetter shows, as a prolific periodical poet. And most recently, featuring prominently in the 19th century, the New magazine, a kind of highbrow periodical from 1877 up until his death, he was effectively the 19th century's in-house poet. And of course, also, usually without his permission, he had his poetry widely published as extracts. And so in global Anglophone print, Tennyson had already gone viral. And so for the New Girl Reader of Atalanta in December 1889, positioned at her own adventual moment of induction into approaching adulthood, this illustrated poetry extract had deep, deep resonance. And so I hope by now you'll agree with me that this illustrated poetry extract is far more interesting than it might first appear. My DVPP team of RAs encountered other examples of illustrated excerpts in Atalanta, so I want to show you to compare them with how Tennyson's treated. And we might term them edge cases in our own indexing taxonomy, but we decided to include them because we're thinking about illustrated poetry extracts as a kind of reader-centered account of what counts as poetry in periodical print. And also because excerpts participate in a poetry culture of cutting and pasting, of reassembly, and of transformation. More about that later. But now let me show you these two extracts from Atalanta because they exemplify a distinctive patterning of page layouts that's become important to my understanding of the culture of extracting and illustrating in which Tennyson was so prominent. So here's one example here from Atalanta, the poem November, illustrated by Ada Bowley, taking up half a page in Atalanta for November 1892. Ada Bowley and her sister May were well-known professional illustrators of books and periodicals, both educated at the Blackheath School of Art, and later also working for the burgeoning postcard manufacturers, such as Raphael Tuck. They were also good friends of Edith Nesbit. And DVPP identifies 20 illustrated poems by Ada Bowley in Atalanta and the English Illustrated Magazine. It's also possible that Bowley, with the initials AB or her AB monogram, might also be the illustrator of the In Memoriam stanza. This poem, November, positioned underneath Bowley's illustrated title, is in quotation marks, of course, with no mention of the source, but it's taken from Shelley's The Cloud and remade into a seasonal, compressed lyric and also a nocturnal about the moon, given a new title to transform it into a seasonal poem to suit the magazine's month of publication. And the fact that it's extracted is suggested by the quotation marks, but otherwise the poem seems complete. But as you'll see, this distinction between what's a whole poem or a complete poem and what's a fragment is one that's really blurry in periodical print. Okay, another example here, Bowley illustrated another poem for Atalanta, May 1893, taking a stanza from Milton's Song on May Morning, which she turns into an illustrated poem called May, with another illustrated title, of course, here featuring a woman's head. And as with the In Memoriam extract, these two illustrated poetry excerpts are all condensed and hyperlyricized, offering remade and repurposed poems. In these three illustrated poetry extracts from Atalanta, the poet as author is clearly sidelined. Not only are none of the poets mentioned by name on the periodical page, but in the poetry extraction print economy, their authorial agency is displaced by the collaboration between the unknown person who excerpted the poem in the first place. So it might not have been Bowley here, for example, but also the collaboration with the illustrator, and also the compositor who would have arranged the page layout, and then also the magazine editor who ordered the poem within the contents of the issue overall. And in the confused and ambiguous copyright law, that's a phrase from Catherine Freely, in which scissors and paste practices of periodical print took full advantage of, consent didn't matter for living authors, although sometimes poetry extracts did include publishers' permissions. In what Amanda Watson terms, quote, the culture of poetry preservation and reuse, unquote, where readers, as well as periodical editors, were highly engaged and highly motivated to interact with and reassemble poems. Agency is also given to readers, who are invited to cut and paste these pages into their commonplace books and albums. And often, in fact, illustrated poetry pages are missing from periodical volumes for this very reason. In turn, periodical print made itself inviting, Watson argues, to the readerly act of remaking, or what she terms assemblage. Tennyson himself was really very aware of poetry reassembly culture, in a way kind of participating in it himself in his compositional habits that underlaid In Memoriam, painstakingly, of course, assembled from separate lyrics, composed at different times, and fragments of an elegy considered as a possible early title. Tennyson, as Marion Shaw notes, also assented to the reassemblage of In Memoriam into publication in separate sections for Palgrave's 1885 selected edition of Tennyson's poems for Macmillan's Golden Treasury series. And Palgrave requested permission from Tennyson to select parts that seemed most lyrical to Palgrave, and Tennyson agreed. Tennyson also seems to have reassembled his own poems in a way too in the process of composition, repurposing poetic phrases and lines from earlier poems into later ones, a habit that Christopher Ricks evocatively terms, quote, a perennial and strange one, a feature of Tennyson's early work in particular. But Tennyson's poetry was also subject to this widespread scissors and paste job later in the century, in which small excerpts of his poems were republished, sometimes with no citation, and illustrated in magazines, newspapers, and periodicals. The technique of scissors and paste repurposing abounded in print as what Catherine Freely calls a widespread practice of excerpting from or recycling articles from other publications. And I'm really interested in the relationship between poetic form and material format that this involves. So that is, what happens to our understanding of poetic form and the formal claims a poem makes for itself through a poem's material manifestation, which includes all aspects of print materiality, but for my purposes in periodical print is especially focusing on the page layout, the illustrations, and the relationship to other poems given the same treatment too. In periodical print, poetry's material format looks very different from its volume publications. Of course, especially I'm thinking of books of original poetry by single authors, but anthologies as well. And this interests me for the ways in which Victorian poetry cultures make claims about what poetry can do and what it can say, and how it invites readings that are contingent on the poem's material form. And often this is not under any control at all of the poet themselves. In the case of the widely varying practice of periodical print, material format has a significant effect on the poem as a unique form and a separate graphic unit on the page. Most fundamentally, the poetic line on the periodical page appears extra prominent, yet sometimes also prominently squeezed into a tiny space, an effect heightened when the poem is closely surrounded by prose contributions. In some periodical titles, this effect is further highlighted by the poem's position in 2 or 3 columns that crams the poem into an often small space on the page, as in the case of filler poetry, while simultaneously highlighting the poem through the space around the poetic line, drawing the eye to it, as we can see, I think, from this example, a page from Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, 2nd of November, 1839, which positions Mariana in the middle of its 3 columns. There's another extreme as well, and this example shows it, where periodicals often could also publish poems without columns, especially monthlies like Macmillan's Magazine, the Cornhill Magazine, and the 19th Century, which highlight a generous space around the poem, signifying literary value, as if the poem works to endow a kind of heightened quality, a heightened poetic value, like a little magic sparkle, acculturating the periodical and also the reader. In the varieties of periodical print treatment, the poem's poetic line seems the most affected formal element, shaped by its treatment within the page format. Tennyson's poetry seems to have especially invited extraction and illustration, a practice that fueled the circulation and reception of his work to become, as we might now say, viral poems. But before I turn to give more examples from Tennyson, I want to pause and explore a little more the wider culture of poetry's making and remaking by extraction and illustration, and why it might matter for the relationship between print format and poetic form. Okay, so back to the In Memoriam extract from Atalanta. The illustrated poetry extract was a regular feature of Victorian periodical print, especially from the 1860s, predominantly, though not only, circulating in serial print. So, for example, there are anthologies of poetry extracts that also included illustrations, like the 1862 Passages from Modern English Poets, charmingly illustrated by the Junior Etching Club, which also includes an illustration of an extract from Tennyson's The Brook. This process of extraction and remaking was part of what Virginia Jackson terms the lyricization of 19th century literary culture, whereby reading and publication practices repurposed poetry as a lyric modality. Casey Leggett argues that, quote, centuries-long practices of excerpting, of cutting poems down to size, played an important role in the rise of shortness and unity as primary attributes of poetry, especially the capacious category we refer to as lyric. We refer to today, as lyric, unquote. But periodical print made the verbal visual extraction format its own, enfolding it within the diverse genres of its own print codes. Although not unique and inextricable to periodical print culture, the poetry extract became a distinctive and widespread feature, condensing and repurposing and often illustrating poems that were originally published elsewhere, so usually in poetry volumes by single authors and really well-known authors as well. And certain magazines were particularly associated with it, especially monthly literary magazines with middle-class readership, like Atalanta and the English Illustrated magazine, and also some illustrated newspapers such as The Graphic. And I'll be giving more examples from these last two titles in a moment. The illustrated periodical poem extract asked to be read in varying ways. Firstly, especially when occupying a full page, it interrupts the other kinds of poetry and prose contributions, framing the page as distinctive and value added. These illustrated pages can additionally call attention to themselves and the materiality by requiring a rotation, as we've seen, of the page to look at the illustrated extract properly. They're a kind of turbocharged iteration of the poem as visual, literary, and a readerly pause in a busy and crowded periodical issue. But as well as offering a standalone and singular contribution that calls for a different kind of reading, the illustrated extract is also inextricably bound both to its periodical heterogeneous print context, read in between other contributions within the issue or number or volume, gesturing to but detached from its source and inviting intertextual reading that's contingent and relational. And so the illustrated poetry extract combines singularity, embeddedness, interruption, and continuity. The illustrated extract invites kind of these multiple kinds of readings. So the poem fragment presented as a standalone poem, sometimes appearing overtly or implicitly as remade into a distinct, almost separate poem of its own. But sometimes it's overtly connected to its source poem, which might or might not be cited. And as a standalone poem, the poetry adaptation works kind of like a meme, like something both recognizable, because the extract's typically from a well-known poem and poet, but it's also something to memorize. It's like an invitation to memorize the extract, an invitation also to become acculturated, or maybe proof that you already are. So I should recognize that poem, or I know where it's taken from. Nonetheless, the standalone poem has a synecdochal relationship with the full, complete poem as a miniaturized version that gestures to an expansiveness beyond this particular periodical number. The excerpt also compresses the poem, so it's usually a longer narrative and dramatic poem that's excerpted, after all, and it presents and remakes it as a lyric, or a kind of lyric. These movements between compression and expansion, the verbal and the visual, the lyric and the narrative, to make the Victorian periodical magazine and newspaper like a kind of little engine of adaptive poetic transformations within serial time that repurposes and reassembles the poem. Okay, so moving into some more examples from Tennyson here, extracting and illustrating Tennyson in the English Illustrated Magazine and the Graphic. The English Illustrated Magazine is a really exciting magazine that deserves more attention. It ran from 1883 to 1913, and it prided itself on featuring the latest innovative illustrations, as well as regular poems that were often prominently illustrated. So 278 out of its 498 poems were illustrated. The magazine, interestingly, didn't publish any entire poems by Tennyson, but it did offer 12 full-page illustrated poetry extracts from Tennyson up to the end of 1901. That's when DVPP finishes indexing. So firstly, it offered the first 2.5 stanzas of Maud, published in April 1895, shortly after Tennyson's death, and this formed the first page of Morris's Kelmscott edition. It also gave 2 stanzas from Mariana, not the first 2 stanzas, however, we'll look at this in a minute, from June 1896, collaboratively illustrated by Herbert and Francis Railton. And it also published 2 lines from The Brook in August 1900, illustrated by Barrington MacGregor, and also 9 really, really brief extracts from The Idylls of the King, published in a series over 9 issues from October 1897 to September 1900. It's a series all illustrated by Gilbert James. So when the English Illustrated Magazine looked for poetry to exemplify its high illustrative and literary ambitions, it again and again chose Tennyson, whose career had, of course, been boosted a long time ago with illustrative treatment. Typically, of course, I'm thinking of the Moxon Tennyson edition of 1857, but there are other examples as well. And I want now to give you some of the most interesting examples from the English Illustrated Magazine, each with a different illustration format and style that were very distinctive from Atalanta's Tennyson extract. Okay, and now my personal favorite, and it's a bit weird. I hope you like it as much as me. So first of all, first example I want to focus on is a 2-page illustration of an excerpt from Mariana that was included in the June 1896 issue of the English Illustrated Magazine. As I mentioned, these illustrations are the collaborative work of a husband and wife team, Herbert and Francis Railton, who designed illustrations for the 1st and the 4th stanzas of the poem, featuring 1 stanza on each page. In this complex page layout, seems also quite incoherent, especially at first glance, multiple depictions of the inside and outside of Mariana's decaying grange are given in 2 different artistic styles that share space with an illustrated and inhabited poem title, line drawings of nude female figures swirling as if through the ether, as well as through the title and the bottom of the 1st stanza and the top of the 2nd, and also, for good measure, an illustration of a mouse and a bat on the final page. The multiple illustrations intersperse the hand-drawn lettering of the poem to graphically, spatially, and poetically push at the integrity of the poem, the poetic line, which is forced to curl around and within the illustration panels. Okay, now for some close-ups. Okay. Along with the 4 different illustration components, the hand-drawn lettering of the poem text kind of aestheticizes the poem so that the text of the poem is itself decorated, while also breaking the integrity of the stanzas with the interrupted and rearranged poetic lines that I think might serve to heighten and lengthen the dying fall of the Tennysonian line's incomplete cadence, as Peter MacDonald terms it. And notably, and I was very delighted to find this, notably the first broken line, where the poem is squeezed between 2 illustration panels depicting the grange, falls at the word fell. The rusty nails fell from the knots. And while the realistic style of the illustrations might be faithful to the poem, other, and at first glance, stranger elements of the page layout invite alternative readings. The exuberant, swirling female figures seem to offer a different narrative outcome for Mariana as an interpretative visual commentary that remakes the excerpted poem into something quite surprising. Their first appearance within the illustrated title has the female figures swirl up and through, and at the start and the end of the lettering of the title word Mariana, apparently representing a liberated character. But there's more. At the bottom of this first page, the two swirling, soaring figures reappear over the last lines of the stanza. So she said, I am aweary, I would that I were dead. With what appears to be their gauzy garments trailing ethereally in the wind to work against and even escape from the languorous decay and eroticized stasis of Mariana's refrain. And one figure here seems to push against the other, Mariana, I think, pushing her upwards and away. And there's another example. So on the top of the second page, the sinuous figures reappear above the two broken lines of this second stanza. Of course, this is the fourth stanza of the original poem. And these lines are also given extra space by the layout. And the swirling figures offer a kind of performative dance. I'm kind of struggling to find vocabulary to describe this. It's a kind of performative dance with one woman with her arms clasped as if in prayer or supplication or pleading, above a prostrate, apparently weeping figure, Mariana herself, I'm imagining, again with swirling diaphanous garments trailing around and between them, and then away from the figures and into the line of the poem. To the right, in the distance, are two smaller figures, as if in the process of fleeing the scene of the poem, harried and yet seeming also to be illustrated, to be liberated. These line drawings of nude female figures right over and against the poem, repurposing it and remaking it through illustrative commentary and interpretation, staging a kind of visual intervention and offering an alternative version of Mariana's fate, I think. The figures also seem to fall away from the poem and from the poem's very words as they fly away. I think this might also explain what first seems to be a visually coherent components of the illustration pages here. So the decorative mouse and the bat, of course, relating to other parts of the poem, but also embedding additional visual signs of escape as the mouse seems to run away from the circular panel depicting Mariana looking outside the Grange's lattice windows. And the bat flies away from the end of the poem entirely towards us, or as if towards the reader anyway. The effect on the poetic line is both poetic and graphic, as lines move and shift and break to accommodate the space of the illustrations, especially giving the broken lines more space and prominence and attaching them visually closer to the illustration component beside them, while also disrupting the integrity of the lines. And especially their proper indentation, in comparison to the original, of course, in a move that visually shunts the corresponding end rhymes away from one another at the start of the extract's second stanza, as a kind of maybe visual delay of the end rhyme effect. The visual design of the poem morphs the stanza's poetic coherence, delaying, displacing, and disrupting the rhyme scheme of the first two stanzas for graphic effect. In this fascinatingly complex page layout, the graphic space of the poem and the graphic space of the illustrations merge so that the poem text itself becomes decorated. And perhaps the sense of the wholeness and stability and strength even of the original's poetic line remains in the reader's memory as the poem is remade, repurposed. But in any case, it also seems to me that the effect of a dying fall and intrinsic melancholy is both intensified and also kind of works against the female figures who are asserting liberation from the poem itself. And perhaps this also enhances the pull, typical in many Tennysonian kind of poems, between entrapment and escape, progression onwards and stasis. And so it seems to me that the emotional effect of extracting the poetic line here is heightened, even as its graphic space and poetic form is remade and repurposed and reshaped. Okay. Hope you're ready for another example. This is my last extended one here. Other poetry excerpts from Tennyson incorporate the text of the poem into the decorative design of the page. In the English Illustrated Magazine for August 1900, two lines from Tennyson's The Brook are illustrated by Barrington MacGregor and presented in quotation marks with a citation to the source, embedded within a full-page illustration that's based on a decorated photograph within a highly stylized frame. The book, of course, was first published in 1855 as an idyll of 228 lines, in which the brook itself intersperses the narrative with its own voice in lyrical quatrains. And these lyrical quatrains in the 19th century, as you might know, were often kind of repurposed and entitled the brook, as if that was the poem, that was the real poem, not the original idyll. The English Illustrated Magazine excerpt is from a particular section of the brook in which the stream speaks, and it's perhaps the most lyrical part of this complex narrative poem. The illustration, however, emphasizes, I think, the narrative movement of the poem, as well as its pastoral setting, featuring prominently the brook itself, as if it were a character in its own right. As with the illustrated Atalanta stanza from In Memoriam, this poem extract is set out as a caption and also a tiny poem all of its own. The brevity of this excerpt deepens an effect of ephemerality and fragmentariness, enhanced by the fact that the lines, of course, here don't rhyme with themselves. And yet this extract works to emphasize the intrinsic and innate poetic quality of the poem from which it's taken, and also implicitly offers Tennyson's name in the citation as a signifier of the poetic. This full-page illustrated poetry extract maximizes the effect of the readerly pause described by Aeneas and Coistra, giving a whole page over to aesthetic and poetic effects, and placing Tennyson at the center of the periodical's work of acculturation and beauty. And now for a detail. So the poetry quotation, the excerpt, is incorporated into the design, embraced either side by the elaborate stylized border, and also by the hand-drawn lettering that includes stylized flourishes that sprout like foliated tendrils in an abstract, rhythmical fashion, reminiscent perhaps of a pen flourish from an illuminated manuscript, medieval manuscript, that highlights an archaism in this treatment of Tennyson. The two lines are depicted as organic, alive, vibrant, mobile, growing even. Perhaps they ask the reader to remember the lines at the end of the pastoral interlude. These are quite famous lines in the 19th century, from which this excerpt is taken, where the brook proclaims, "For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever." This illustrated excerpt takes the formal work of the idyll tradition literally, or rather visually, even as it miniaturizes the poem by offering a little picture where even the poem's words are decorated. This illustrative archaism, of course, works against the modernity of the central photograph. The English Illustrated Magazine commonly used photographs to illustrate poetry, exploiting recent printing developments for mass publication and the promotion of a special aesthetic charm in the pages of a mass-produced magazine. The implication is that Tennyson too perhaps combines poetic archaism with modernity. The illustration's border includes foliate and vegetal features, as well as stylized flowers, several insects, especially dragonflies, which are at rest or in flight. The excerpt's presentation, in quotation marks, emphasizes its fragmentariness as it gestures to the complete poem. Tennyson's poetry is here fragmented, decorated, and stylized, explicating the pastoral scene above, which also illustrates the pastoral poem, as image and quotation refer back to each other, as well as the larger poetic world of the complete poem, and indeed of Tennyson as a signifier of poetic beauty. Readers of this August 1900 issue of the English Illustrated Magazine would have encountered this illustrated extract from the book as an interruption to an overtly linked series of other illustrated extracts from Tennyson's Idylls of the King, illustrated by Gilbert James. So I'm giving you here the last two in the series from James's illustrated poem excerpts, and the book was published kind of in between these, in an issue in between these two poems. So this series of excerpts offers the Idylls in miniature, prominently selecting and visualizing arguably the most dramatic moments over its multiple long narrative installments, like an ultra condensed serial tale that helpfully gives a title with each illustration to orient the reader to the larger narrative, heightening key aspects of the idols, like a selection box of your favorite chocolates. These illustrated excerpts appeared over nine installments from October 1897 to September 1900. And so for August 1900, MacGregor's illustrative treatment of the Brook appeared the month before the final installment of James's series. The reader of the English Illustrated Magazine, therefore, was attuned to waiting for Tennyson's semi-regular monthly appearance and would have viewed the full-page illustration of 2 lines from the Brook, alongside James's very different full-page treatment of tiny quotations from the Idylls. I offer this example to illustrate the heterogeneity of periodical print and the reader's encounter with illustrated poetry extracts within it. So the reader is, of course, not seeing these pages in isolation, but rather within a rich, complex, and dynamic, as well as contingent, ephemeral world of serial print culture, where varying kinds of rhythmical patterns across serial time offer poetry extracts through recurring and diverse illustrative treatments and page layouts. Okay, I'm going to move on and give you some other examples from the graphic now. It's my concluding title that I want to show you. Readers were also consuming illustrated poetry extracts from Tennyson in other serial titles as well, of course. The example from Atalanta was published on December 1889, and the examples from the English Illustrated Magazine date from April 1895. Digital Victorian periodical poetry also includes The Graphic, an illustrated newspaper founded in 1869, and it was aimed at a similar audience of middle-class readers, and it very regularly published Tennyson extracts with full-page and sometimes double-spreader illustrations, dating from June 1874 and continuing right up until the century's end. So I'm going to briefly offer this newspaper's inclusion of illustrated poetry extracts to show a treatment of Tennyson that clearly extracts his poetry as shorthand for various concepts, especially the monarchy, empire, beauty, and the poetic itself. And here is the first example we found in the graphic, giving a Tennysonian excerpt. So this is from the weekly issue for the 27th of June, 1874, which included a double-page spreader reproducing an engraving from Samuel Fildes' much-praised painting that was exhibited in the Royal Academy for 1872. And Fildes's painting was hung prominently on the middle of a wall, of course, a much prized location, and extraordinary for a relative artist newcomer. This engraving for the graphic, entitled Fair Quiet and Sweet Rest, is captioned with 3 lines from Tennyson's Lotus Eaters, of course, from 1832, first published then. The extract illustrates the engraving with an expression of pleasure at half dreaming, capturing the leisured ease that Fildes's painting depicts. And a painting, of course, that's entirely unrelated to the poem, but placed in a happy pairing in the pages of the graphic. And this was a repeated and regular feature of the newspaper, combining large full-page and double-spreader illustrations with illustrative poetry excerpts as captions. And Tennyson was a favourite to be excerpted for this, but other poets also were used. And this extract works as a quotation from a familiar poem that heightens the aesthetic meanings of Fildes's painting, giving a value-added component to this well-executed engraving. And I'm going to quickly give you 2 other examples before concluding. The graphic on other occasions dipped into Tennyson's works to cut and paste appropriate sentiments for its lavish illustrations, as if a small handful of his poetic lines could be plucked from the original poem and instantly served up for the required readerly effect. Perhaps most prominently and poignantly, the graphic's memorial supplement to Tennyson, published on the 15th of October 1892, repurposed lines from Tennyson's Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington to caption 2 full-page illustrations. This is the first one. It's the frontispiece to this memorial issue, illustrating a moment from the memorial service in Westminster Abbey. And the second example depicts the digging of Tennyson's own resting place in Poet's Corner. In these examples, an extract from Tennyson signifies all that Tennyson achieved and stood for, and the extracts are transformed into elegies in miniature for Tennyson himself. Okay, I'm moving to some concluding comments here as I'm trying to pull together my ideas about the poetic line and how it relates to Tennyson in illustrated, extracted poetry in periodicals and newspapers and magazines. So, okay, to finish, in the complex, vast, and ever receding horizon of periodical print, illustrated poetry excerpts from Tennyson seem to signify the poetic mode itself, while also often disrupting the poetic line's graphic format, while nonetheless heightening its characteristic falling lyric cadence effects, for which Tennyson's poetry was so well known. Late Victorian periodical titles cut and pasted Tennyson's poems from editions of his poetry volumes in a process that involved exertion, illustration, and pasting, remaking and repurposing whole poems out of extracts that seem to kind of deform the integrity of the original source's poetic lines and rhyme pattern effect, while also framing the illustrated extract to signify nothing less than the poetic itself. A Tennysonian fragment can still carry the poetic and emotive power of the original poem, and also serves to stand in for it too. These illustrated excerpts relied on the literary fame of Tennyson to acculturate and beautify the periodical pages and shape readers for poetry who were adept at recognizing the poems and reading them visually through the patterns of recurring illustrative treatment and page layout. Tennyson's poetry was repackaged and reassembled for readers, attuned to scissors and paste print media, extraction economies, and serial reading. This extraction culture also brought a repackaged, condensed, and illustrated Tennyson into the everyday lives of readers as they consumed highly circulating weeklies and monthlies. The illustrated periodical poetry extract, which hugely favoured Tennyson's poetry, brought Tennyson home to his readers over and over and over again. And so, a concluding irony, Tennyson's poetry is brought home repeatedly and often in tiny pieces into the daily lives of Victorian readers. But as a poet, he's also displaced. I have been telling you not so much a reception history as a remaking history. And through all of this, what remains, I think, is the continuing poetic and effective force of Tennyson's poetic line, in which the process of extracting and illustrating and rearranging on the periodical page comes to signify something much, much weightier than its tiny, tiny space. In choosing a few lines to excerpt and illustrate, periodical print's act of breaking off and then picturing a fragment of Tennyson's poetry both visualizes and also heightens the falling cadence, an effect deepened even further by an appeal to the memory of the complete poem. And so the Tennysonian illustrated periodical poetry extract relies on the power of the poetic line, even as it breaks it and breaks it off. By the century's end, for middle-class readers of Victorian periodical print, the significance of Tennyson and poetry itself could be embodied and memorized and held in their hands as they read the latest ephemeral serial print, a tiny handful of illustrated poetic lines capturing not just an essence of his poetry, but perhaps also poetry itself. Okay, thank you. And I think I will also stop sharing the slides, shall I?